Hi everybody. What we're going to talk about in this particular video is depth of field, or DOF. Now it's controlled by the lens opening on your camera, or what is called the aperture. And it is also affected by how closely you zoom in to your subject, which is the lens focal length. Now the reason why you want to control depth of field is so that often you want to blur the background behind your main subject or in front of your main subject, and other times you may want things that are both in the foreground as well as the background all to be in focus. You control that by controlling your depth of field. Okay, in this slide, what I'm trying to show is what is going on. In the center of the screen there you can see a camera. It's pointing and presumably focused on the soldier there on the left. Now in reality though, when you focus say right on his nose, there's a little distance behind his nose, maybe behind his head, that's also in acceptable focus, and that's trying to be shown by the dotted lines there on the left. And there's also a little distance right in front of his nose that any subject at that point would also be an acceptable focus. The distance between that point in front of his nose and that point behind his head is called the depth of field. And it's between those 2 points that everything between those 2 points is in focus. Now, what has that got to do with your camera? Well, that's the aperture or the lens opening of your camera that's controlling that. And it's measured in something called F-stops. Now over there on the right hand side of the screen, you can see where a large aperture, which corresponds to a small f-stop number, something like f2.8 would be a small f-stop number. That's a small depth of field, which means there's only a small distance in front of the soldier's nose and behind his head that is also in focus. At the other end of the extreme, a small aperture or a small lens opening would have associated with it a large f-stop number, say f8.9 or f11 or f16 and even higher. That very small lens opening is associated with a larger depth of field. And in such a situation, maybe subjects both in the foreground relative to where you focused and objects well behind where you focused would also be in acceptable focus. Now in the lower right hand corner, you can see the effect of zooming in. The more you zoom in, the smaller the depth of field, the smaller the distance between those objects closer to the camera and those objects that are further from the camera are in acceptable focus. And presumably, or going along with that if you will, your main subject of focus is somewhere in between those 2 points. Now again, if you're going to be taking a portrait of a person and want to, or any subject, and you don't want the background to take away from the focus on your subject, you would tend to use a large aperture corresponding to a small f-stop number so that the objects behind your main subject would be somewhat out of focus, or maybe a lot of out of focus, maybe very blurry, depending upon how much you've zoomed in on your subject and the lens you have on your camera. In contrast, if you're taking a landscape picture where often the goal is to have objects both nearer to the camera as those as well off in the distance all be in acceptable focus, then you would be using a small f-stop or a small lens opening or aperture and a large f-stop number. That would give you a large depth of field, the distance between subjects or objects in the front and objects well behind your main subject of focus, all in acceptable focus. Hope this gives you a little idea of what Either you are controlling when you put your camera in aperture preferred mode or in the manual mode, or if you don't have a camera that does that, you can kind of see what's going on inside your camera when you put it in one of those scenic modes like landscape or portrait. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.